Last time we were talking about Bastiat, it's the law, and we were closing with the idea that I said forced associations are unjust, but voluntary associations are just. And he's making the point that if you're not going to have the government engaging in legalized plunder, what do you do about poor people, right? Or what do you do about people that have low value of marginal product from our perspective? Then voluntary associations have to take care of them. That is, he says that you need to have voluntary associations. That you can't just say, oh, gee, they're poor, I guess we're going to let them starve to death. Okay? The idea is that you can't rely on government to do it, but that means that you have to rely on yourself. You have to form, women's society to help out the homeless or whatever. We have St. Peter's Free Clinic that on, I don't know, Tuesdays or whatever, and a bunch of churches give money to St. Peter's to have this free clinic, and people go there. We've actually talked about Hillsdale being a small town. There tends to be more of that. We talked about the tragedy of compassion that, again, Bastiat's writing in 1850, but remember de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, one of the things that he talked about was when he got to America, there's all these associations there. People are having barn raisings, and he was surprised at how much philanthropic organization there was. In The Tragedy of Compassion, the book argues that it's a history of the voluntary associations in the late 19th century. Basically argues that once the government started getting engaged in providing the service, providing what we would call philanthropy, but in a moment we'll talk about why government can't be philanthropic. But nonetheless, if once government starts redistributing income, then it's not going to work out very well. That's why we read the article. I read you the article about the Chicago fire and the article about the Michigan fire and the North Dakota flood. Bert Folsom's article last time. Then he said that Bastiat said that being against government provision of a good, in particular education, that if you're against that, it doesn't mean you're against the good itself, right? So being against government production of a good doesn't mean you're against the good itself. And like I said, he talks about education. That's his example. But notice how much this sounded like Mises here, right? Mises said that if you're against a policy that's popular because you see the unintended consequences of it and you think it's not going to work out very well, you're going to be called an enemy of the people. In 1850, Bastiat's saying, you know what, I'm against public production of education, and that doesn't mean I'm against education. But listen to people who are running for president or running for Congress or whatever. They will be saying exactly what Bastiat was talking about. They'll say, gee, you're against Medicaid, you're against free health care for everybody. If you're against free health care for everybody, then you don't want people to have health care, right? You just don't care if that single mom with 2 kids in East Los Angeles, if she can take her kids to the doctor, you just don't care about that because you're against government provision of that. And so Bastiat's saying, that is incorrect. You can be for that woman to be able to take her kids to the doctors, and still be against government production of that, government providing the health care. And so, again, very similar to what Mises was saying, Bastiat sort of complaining that, he was a politician. He was basically complaining that people are declaring that he's against education simply because he doesn't think that the government ought to be providing it. That's, again, public housing projects. We talked about Cabrini Green and Jefferson Avenue project. Being against public housing doesn't mean you're against people having housing. Then he says that, again, Mises was talking about socialists as still wanting to create wealth for the masses, but they can't get it right? Just as you answered on the midterm, they can't solve the incentive problem. How to get people to take on the risk of innovation, how to get people to work hard. Can't solve the information problem, the fact that information is decentralized. Nobody can know how much Lady Gaga underwear everybody's going to want, next week. And so this, because knowledge is decentralized, the central planner can't possibly know the value of resources or the relative value of goods and services. So, but Bastiat's saying socialists don't want to create wealth for the masses. He says that socialists want basically to always believe they will be doing the one that's doing the planning, and they're trying to make the world in their image, right? So it says, right, they will plan, and they want to make the world in their image. They want to make it the way they want it to be. So if we just let you guys act according to your own plan, right? What is it? We said that capitalism is a system of voluntary exchange, right? If we just let the world be a system of voluntary exchange, guess what? You're going to run around driving Ford F-150 pickups when you really should be buying Chevy Volts, okay? And if I just let you guys choose what vehicle to drive or what vehicle to buy, then you're not going to buy the vehicles that I think is best for the world. So, but Bastiat is saying is that socialists, they can't rely on you guys having any freedom, because if you're free to act, you're going to buy the wrong stuff. You're going to watch the wrong television. You're going to be watching Deal or No Deal, and you should be watching Victoria. And so, sort of a conflict between my wife and I, but because she's always wanting to watch Deal or No Deal, right? So anyway, and so they think they will be doing the planning as well. Why do you find it that academics tend to be people who believe in central planning? They tend to be that way because they think they're the ones that are going to be doing the planning. It's interesting that Hayek also said the same thing, where he made the same point. He says, why is it that academics tend to be central planners? Is it because people think they're the ones going to be asked? If you are chairman of the sociology department at Berkeley, you think that when the government's out there planning what people ought to be doing, you're going to be the one they're going to talk to. If you were to say, oh yeah, we're going to have a central planner, what we're going to do is we're going to take the last 150 people who flunked out of Cody High School in Detroit, they're going to be the ones be doing the planning, right? Then, oh, no, that's not the way it's supposed to work, right? What's supposed to work is you're supposed to ask me, right? I'm the one with a PhD. You're supposed to be the one asking me. And so, again, that is, we know that the academic community tends to be much more towards government intervention than the people in general. And one explanation of that, Bastiat would say, is because they think they're the ones that's going to be asked. They have a vision of the world. They've been thinking about it, right? You guys in here, you just haven't been thinking about what the world should be looking like, and you don't have a plan to how to get there. And so you guys ought to let me decide that. Then he says that he has about 20 pages where he makes a case of socialism as an unjust system. Right? He says that he argues against socialism because it's unjust. Not that Mises argued against socialism saying it can't create wealth for the masses, but Bastiat is arguing against socialism as a whole, about a 20-page discussion where he describes why it's an unjust system. Notice that he also says that why does it make logical sense to say that you are capable of voting for the person that is best, but not for making decisions about your everyday activity. That is, what you're going to buy and what you're not going to buy and what should be produced, etc. So the question is, what about this logic? Right? You're smart enough to know who to vote for, but not what products to buy or jobs to take. That's what democratic socialism would be about, right? We're going to have a socialist system. We're going to have a central planner. You guys all get to vote. Okay? Bernie Sanders doesn't say, oh, we're going to have socialism and I'm going to be the king. Okay? That I'm just the authoritarian person. We don't need to have an election next time. It's just going to be Bernie Sanders takes over because he's got an idea of how to run things. That's not what he says, right? He's a democratic socialist. Same with Elizabeth Warren. Right? Elizabeth Warren doesn't say, well, Bernie Sanders and I are going to have a jousting, and whoever wins the joust gets to be the person in charge of everything. Okay? The idea is that, oh, you got to vote for Elizabeth Warren. Well, does that make sense to say, oh, guy, you don't know whether this Ford F-150 pickup is better for you than the Chevy Volt that we want you to buy. You can't know that, but you can know who to vote for to tell you what vehicle to use. But logically, it ought to be just the opposite, right? Because if you're making a decision about whether to buy the Ford F-150 pickup or the Chevy Volt, then you're going to know a lot about your particular circumstance, how much income you have, what you're going to need the vehicle for. You're going to know all that, right? Now, we know that you aren't going to know anything about the person you're voting for because you're all what? You're all rationally ignorant, right? You are rationally, it's not that you're not smart enough to know, but the probability of you affecting the outcome is of an election, if you're determining the person who's going to win, that probability is near zero. So if there's a marginal cost to you of figuring out what committees your state representative sits on and what bills they've introduced and what their voting record is, for you to know all that is very expensive to figure that out. And is your vote going to determine which person wins, right? Probably not. Certainly not your vote for president. So if you sort of think about it, suppose that you thought that Hillary Clinton would be the worst president in history, that the economy would sink by 5% every quarter, that all sorts of bad stuff would happen if Hillary Clinton would become president. But you want to vote for the woman, you can say, oh, I voted for the first woman to run for president. Why not vote for Hillary Clinton, right? The probability that your vote is going to make Hillary Clinton, suppose that your vote did make Hillary Clinton president instead of whoever she might be running against. You'd feel really bummed, right? But what would need to happen? What would need to happen is whatever state you're in, you would have to make it win by one vote in your state, and then your state being the state that moved the electoral college from one person to the other. The probability of that is near zero, right? So why not vote for Hillary Clinton? So if we sort of think about whether democratic socialism makes sense, why would we think that people voting for whoever's going to be the central planner makes any sense at all? They should know more about their everyday circumstance than whoever they're voting for. So if you're going to have a central planner, why are you letting all these idiots vote, right? And they could be extremely smart, but they have a marginal cost of figuring out who's the best person to vote for. And so why would we expect that to turn out well? You'd think that if we were going to have socialism, then what we ought to have is just have whoever's the smartest central planner become the dictator, become the central planner. Then he says, he says liberty is the union of all liberties. And so liberty is the union of all liberties. Well, think about how that sounds like Mises. Right? Mises says you can't have political liberty without economic liberty. Right? And so what is Bastiat saying here? He's basically saying that you can't have liberty in terms of voting for your people that you're going to run for office, but not have economic liberty. He says liberty is the union of all liberties. And so that, is highly consistent with what Mises was arguing about. And the quote is not liberty the freedom of every person to make full use of his faculties so long as he does not harm another person while doing so? Right? So he says, what is freedom about? It's about your ability to act according to your own plan as long as you don't infringe on my liberty. Again, what that's going to look like, what Hayek says. Right? Hayek says that what liberty says is that you can make yourself better off but you can't invade someone else's property rights. So that when we read Hayek, he's going to talk about property rights as being this sphere of free action. He's talking about what's the purpose of the law. The purpose of the law is to set this boundary over which you can act according to your own plan. If your plan is to steal my stuff, then the government ought to be able to come in and say, okay, your plan is to steal my stuff, my plan is to keep my stuff, and so we can't both be doing what we want. So the government's got to come in and say, okay, here's where the property rights are. Bastiat is saying pretty much the same thing here. He says that what can you do? What is liberty? Liberty is about your ability to act to make yourself better off as long as you don't harm me, as long as you don't interfere with my free action. So again, very consistent with what Hayek's going to write about 110 years later in the Constitution of Liberty. Again, in this next section, he emphasizes this idea that socialism is about the socialists have a vision of the world. And they're trying to impose that vision on you, right? Impose on everybody else. Listen to anybody that is running for president that's a socialist, they're gonna talk about what their view of the world would look like, right? And how it's all, we're all gonna sit around and sing Kumbaya, and it's, everything's gonna be, we're gonna be living on Hard Rock County Mountain. Okay. Has anybody? I've heard of Hard Rock County Mountain. Okay. Google Hard Rock County Mountain. Okay. I don't know what they're teaching you in high schools, but all right. So, but his point is that the what the socialists are out there doing is out there saying, here's what the world view, here's what the world ought to look like. We're all going to have free health care. We're all going to be able to go to college for free. We're all going to have a certain amount of income no matter what we do. Everybody's going to drive a car that doesn't use any fossil fuels, which is sort of hard because how are you going to plug the darn things in? But nonetheless, everybody will just plug their electric cars into a grid that only has wind and solar power in it. So don't try to plug your car in at night on a calm day. But nonetheless, that's what Bastiat is saying, is that the central planner is going to have this vision of the world, and the purpose, why they want to be socialists is in order to make the world look like they want it to. Again, different than Mises. Mises you didn't read anything in liberalism that said socialists were trying to do this, right? His discussion about socialism is why it can't produce wealth for the masses. That's his gripe with socialism. Again, notice that nearly every socialist system is dictatorial, right? Authoritarian. All you got to do is authoritarian. Because that's the only way it works, right? The only way that you guys are going to work in the way the central planner wants it to is they're going to tell you what to do. Here's the vehicle you can drive. Here is what food you have to eat. Here is, you can't eat meat because cows release methane. I don't know if anybody ever been on a cattle ranch, but or a dairy farm. But they release methane. Oh, that's funny. You hear about them saying they shouldn't eat meat, right? I mean, you've heard that discussion, right? Shouldn't eat meat because of the methane gas. The AOC's talked about this, but she hasn't said anything about milk. So maybe, because you can make soy milk, right? So, but anyway, the point is that you have to have an authoritarian government. So all you got to do is look at the Index of Economic Freedom that is on the, in the folder there, in the Wolfram folder on box. Look at the Index of Economic Freedom and say, okay, here's the countries that are in the top 25%. Start looking through them and say, oh, here, how many of these countries are authoritarian, right? You got Hong Kong and Singapore, but after that, probably not. Look at the countries in the bottom 25%. They're all authoritarian. You're going to, Venezuela, right? Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria. Look through all of those. Why is that? Because the logic of how the system works has got to be, I got to be authoritarian in order to make the system turn out the way I want it to. Then he has this discussion about liberty as the power to act. Or the power to accomplish things. And he has this discussion about, there's a confusion. He's looking at a letter by Louis Blanc. He's responding to a contemporary, Louis Blanc, and he's writing this letter to him. And he's saying, hey, you are confusing the ability to accomplish stuff with the ability to accomplish stuff with freedom. So what would we say? We'd say, okay, Lady Gaga has way more ability to accomplish stuff than you do, right? She can hire a lobbyist to make sure that people wear the Lady Gaga clothing line. She can do, things like that. Which I presume there's a Lady Gaga clothing line. I don't know, but there should be, right? If you were Lady Gaga. But in any event, the point is that because she's wealthy, she has the ability to influence what the government can do, and she has the ability to do things that you can't do. She has the ability to, get in her jet and fly, around the world if she wanted to in her private jet, and you don't have that. So if we want to, he says, if we want to equalize liberty, what's going to happen? It's going to say you need to equalize income. That is, if freedom is consistent with, not consistent, but if freedom is the same thing as the ability to do things, then that is going to require a redistribution of income in order to equalize liberty for everybody. So that Louis Blanc's argument is really going to be an argument for redistribution. And of course you hear this all the time, right? That the 1% have all this power out there. And we need to take away from the incomes from the 1% because they can do all this stuff and they can influence what the government does, and that's the problem. So how do we solve this problem of you guys have less ability to do stuff than Lady Gaga? You gotta tax Lady Gaga and give it to the rest of us. Now it's interesting that what's going to happen is Hayek is going to say the same thing. Hayek has a discussion about the beliefs of John R. Commons, who is a economics professor at the University of Wisconsin at the same time that Hayek's writing the Constitution of Liberty. And so when we read the Constitution of Liberty, we'll see that Hayek's arguments about John R. Commons confusing the freedom with the ability to, the range of options that you have, is going to lead to simply redistribution. It's the exact same thing that Bastiat, when you read the law, Bastiat's discussion of when he's talking to Louis Blanc about this. So again, when we get to the Constitution of Liberty, think back to what Bastiat was saying with regard to this inability to distinguish between liberty and the range of options that you have, or the power that you have to accomplish things. Then he has a discussion that legislators are human just like we are. And what he's really talking about here is they'll respond to incentives. Like anyone else. Basically making the argument that if you are a legislator, you're going to behave in the parliament in the same way that you're going to behave in the Kroger's. That is, when you go to Kroger's, what do you try to do? You try to make yourself better off, right? You buy things as long as the added benefit is bigger than the added cost. And if somebody changes the price of one good, it'll cause you to have a higher or lesser demand for a substitute or a complement or whatever, okay? So what Bastiat says here is, you know what? Here's what's going on. If legalized plunder is the rule, then your legislator is going to engage in it. And that has a few interesting things about it. One is that public choice is Econ 415. What it is about is a study of using the theory of economics to explain political behavior. That did not exist. The study of public choice didn't exist in really as a whole study in the 1930s, 1940s. It isn't until James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, James Buchanan has been thought of as the founder of public choice theory, which is essentially what Bastiat is talking about here. That is, if I want to guess what your legislator is going to do, all I got to realize is that they're going to respond in the legislative arena the same way they're going to respond at the grocery store. They're going to do whatever it is that's going to make themselves better off. Now, Buchanan is the one that, again, is thought of as the founder of public choice theory. He and Gordon Tullock wrote a book, 1962, called The Calculus of Consent, which is sort of the, if you've heard of Mises's human action, it's sort of the human action, the equivalent of Mises's human action. That is, it's it takes all the writings that they've done early on and combined them and laid this out in a book, The Calculus of Consent. So what's it about? It's about how people respond within the political framework, both legislators and voters. Bastiat is 100 years earlier, is giving you an indication about that. He says, look, legislators, if the rules of the game are they're going to engage in legalized plunder, that's what they're going to do. So he's not blaming the legislators for legalized plunder. They're just going to act the way that Jim Buchanan and Gordon Tullock talk about in the 100 years later. They're just trying to do the thing that makes themselves better off. So, when we talked about once government engages in legalized plunder, what's going to happen? Okay, your legislator will also engage, right? There's no way that they're going to respond to the incentives. They're going to be made better off if they engage in legalized plunder. And so what does that mean? It means that you can't eliminate legalized plunder by electing new officials. Right, by electing new officials. Right? He's not blaming the legislators. The only way that you can reduce or eliminate the government engaging in legalized plunder is to win the battle of ideas. In other words, to convince the voters, right? He's saying, look, you can elect whoever you want, but that's not going to change government engaging in legalized plunder, because once I'm there, once I'm your representative, I got an incentive to engage in legalized plunder if that's what the rules of the game are, right? When I was Congressman Smith's chief of staff, got in there, we didn't say, oh, we're not going to try to get any of this, any of this program's money for our constituency because that's legalized plunder, okay? We're going to go, hey, if we don't get it, Alabama's going to get it. There's not going to be less of this money out there for this program because we don't get it for our constituents. So we're going to engage in legalized plunder to the best of our ability. And what is it like? It's exactly like when we had the white rhinoceros, okay? The white rhinoceros are the equivalent of a government program that hands money out. If you don't grab it, somebody else will. You can't say, oh, gee, I'm a state rep or I'm a congressman, and so I'm going to make sure that my folks don't engage in this because I want to send a signal that this is a bad idea. No, ain't going to work. What you could do is that, Congressman Smith, we would argue against the program in the first place. But once that program was there, we tried to get stuff for our constituency. Bastiat's talking about this in 1850. He's saying, look, if you want the government to not engage in legalized plunder so much, then what do you have to do? You have to persuade people that that shouldn't be how the rules of the game are. You got to change what the rules of the game are. So you could convince people to adopt a constitutional amendment that wouldn't allow for redistribution beyond a certain amount or something. Okay, whatever your idea would be, is that you need to persuade people to change the system so that the government can't engage in legalized plunder. And again, this whole idea of coming back to winning the battle of ideas, that's what Mises says too, right? Mises says, hey, how are we gonna make this work out so we don't have World War II, we don't have the Great Depression, and da-da-da-da. He says you got to, first of all, get people's attention, right? You got to convince people this is an important issue, and then you have to persuade them to become classical liberals. That anti-liberal thought is what's going to cause these problems. It doesn't say, oh, we'll have the wrong legislators there. He doesn't say, that somehow if we had better monetary policy, this wouldn't happen. He says, anti-liberal thought is the problem, and you guys need to reestablish liberalism. Very consistent with what Bastiat is saying here. He's foreshadowing what Mises talks about. He's foreshadowing what Hayek talks about with regard to what the role of government ought be. Then he again comes up with this point that once government is engaged in legalized plunder, what's going to happen? You're going to blame government for not accomplishing what it can't really accomplish anyway. Because what's going to go on is the government's going to tell you, oh, hey, we should be doing all this. We can take care of all this. We're going to set the price of gasoline so that everybody can use gasoline. This is Venezuela, right? So we're going to set the price of gasoline so that everybody can use gasoline. We're going to set it below the equilibrium. Well, that works as long as oil prices are $100 a barrel and your state government, the government owns the oil company, okay? But what happens after a while is that, hey, government's going bankrupt, the world's coming down around our ears, so we're going to have to raise the price of gasoline. What do? You guys have revolutions, right? So his point here is that government's going to presume to take on all sorts of stuff it can't accomplish if it's going to be socialist, right? If it's going to engage in legalized plunder, if it's going to be socialist. And what's going to happen is you guys are going to think the government should provide free health care, right? I don't know if you ever seen anything about this, but what's going on? People are complaining about what? About the high cost of high premiums for health care now, right? Healthcare premium, if you buy health insurance, you probably don't buy your own health insurance, but if you did, you'd be complaining that health insurance premiums have been going up like crazy the last 5-6 years. Well, what's going on? The government should be taking care of this, right? The government should be setting prices for prescription drugs. The government should be, limiting what these darn insurance companies can charge for their premiums. Listen to, AOC or listen to Elizabeth Warren or whatever. They want the government to set a limit on what the premiums can be. Well, that can't possibly work, right? Because if we sort of think about it, why is it that we've got such high healthcare premiums, it's because of going back to the Affordable Care Act, right? That's one of the things that was driving up. And if you go way back, the Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. So yeah, lots and lots of people now have health insurance, but nobody can pay for it, right? So that, at least that's what people are arguing. So what's going on is that you're going to start blaming you're going to say, wow, insurance premiums going up, that's the government's fault, right? Why is that the government's fault? Because the government just told you it could provide health care for everybody. And so it can't accomplish stuff. When it can't accomplish stuff, you're going to blame the government. And then what he says, we've talked about this before, but revolution, right? We talked about the fact that, he's writing in 1850. He's been living in France, 1830. You've got revolution in France. 1848, you have a revolution in France. What's he saying? Why is this revolution happening? This revolution is happening because government's engaging in legalized plunder. It's telling people that socialism can work. It's trying to take on much more than it can possibly accomplish, and so you end up with revolution. In a sense, you have a little bit of that going on today with homeschooling. What is homeschooling about? Homeschooling is saying, I'm revolting against the public education system. So if you look at today, there's a lot more homeschooling today than there was 50 years ago. And one of the reasons that is because people are saying, why am I homeschooling? I'm homeschooling because I can produce higher education, better education than the public school that I'm trying to send my kid to. So there's different ways that we can revolt. Just as we said that you could hire lobbyists to do that, or you could have special interest groups will tend to take over things. But his point is simply that once government is going to take on all this activity that it can't possibly accomplish, and what's going to happen is you guys are going to get irritated with it. And your mechanism for revolting might be different. You might hire lobbyists, or you might form super PACs, or you might do that kind of stuff. Or you might, as Bastiat was saying, you might have total revolution. Then my favorite part of the book is next, where he says the science of economics is logically prior to a science of politics. Logically prior to a science of politics. And why is that, right? Because you need to know how people behave. You need to know what the results of the interactions are going to be. You need the results of people's interactions, and then decide what the role of government is going to be. Decide the role of government. So let's think about how Mises developed the argument in classical liberalism. He started out with, I want to create wealth for the masses. Then he starts out with, then he talks about why other systems can't do that, and he says, here's the role of government. Here's the foundations of liberalism. You just answered that on the midterm. The question on the foundations it said, tell me what are three foundations of liberalism, and why did Mises put them in there, right? Mises put them in there because that perspective on what government ought to be doing is what makes it so that market capitalism works. And why do I want market capitalism work? Because it will create wealth for the masses. So what he's talking about is, I got to know what the economic structure is going to look like. I got to know if you guys are running around acting according to your own plan, is that going to come out well or not well? So we know that anarchy isn't going to work, right? That one of the foundations of liberalism was that you ought to have a government because in the absence of government, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, okay? So I need a government to protect property rights. Okay, that's what I need for the system to work. We got to have property rights, and so I need a government to do that. And therefore, what is the role of government? The role of government would be not to try to redistribute, to engage in legalized plunder. The role of government is to protect property rights. Now, and then what does he talk about? He says, well, once the government intervenes, then it causes unintended consequences. So we got to think through, how does the economic system work before we think about, okay, what should our political system look like? Can't be the other way around. And notice that's how the class is structured, right? We started out with saying, 9 million people woke up in New York City today. There was exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee and peanuts and everything else. Happened again today. How did that happen? So we learned about demand, and we learned about supply and equilibrium price, and how the price system works, and how profit acts as a mechanism to respond to changes in your consumer demand. You guys want more Lady Gaga underwear, then the demand curve for Lady Gaga underwear is going to shift to the right, and prices will rise, and the company making Lady Gaga underwear will be making economic profit, and other firms will enter, which will shift the supply curve out even more, et cetera, right? So we think through that, okay, so what do we need government to do? Government is not there to say, oh, we have now figured out that everybody wants more Lady Gaga underwear, and therefore we're going to tell all the producers, here's how much Lady Gaga underwear to do, right? We don't do it that way. Why don't we do it that way? Because the central planner can't possibly know all that, right? And so what we did is we developed, here's how markets work, and then started talking about philosophy of government, right? Then we read, it would have made sense to do Mises's liberalism without having done demand and supply curves and how prices work. Wouldn't do sense to read the law prior to talking about, hey, here's how the economic system works. So the point he's making here is, if I'm going to talk about what the role of government is, I got to first think through what happens when you guys are all acting according to your own plan. If what you're going to do is, you guys, when we talked about externalities, pollution already. That is, if you don't take into consideration all the costs, because you're imposing costs on me that you don't have to pay for, then what will happen is that marginal costs won't equal marginal benefit, right? Marginal costs will be higher than marginal benefit because you guys aren't including them all. So you might have rules against pollution. But how did we develop that it's the role of government to have a law against pollution, right? Or have some mechanism to deal with pollution? We developed that by thinking through, okay, what's the optimal amount, right? Where should we ought to be, right? Where demand and supply curves intersect, where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. So we developed that before we developed, here's what government's role ought to be in order to deal with these situations. All right. I won't have the exams back on Monday. I always try to have them back within a week. So the plan is to have them back on Wednesday. So Monday, we have now pretty well finished the law. We just got a tiny little bit. But read the introduction to Constitution of Liberty, because that's the next thing we're in, right?